Welcome back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. U.S. Senator Rand Paul is traveling the state as he seeks a second term in Washington. Senator Paul spent some of last year running for president while also remaining a candidate for re-election here in Kentucky. He pushed for a caucus so he could seek 2 offices at once in Kentucky, but then dropped out of the race for the White House before the primaries started. Since then, he's held numerous town hall meetings to talk with those he represents. It appears the Republicans are set to nominate Donald Trump, who was harshly critical of Paul in the debates. Senator Paul is a medical doctor and an ophthalmologist who has long pushed for smaller government and less federal debt. He is joining us today, and Senator Paul, we welcome you. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be with you.
Let's get to this current major and tragic issue, the shooting massacre in Orlando. 49 people were killed last weekend. There are many calls for action, including preventing people on terrorist watch lists from being able to purchase guns. Some recent numbers show that 91% of the time when people on those lists went to purchase a gun, they were able to complete the purchase. You have had reservations about that in the past. Is there a version of a proposal you would support?
You know, it's a horrific tragedy, and, you know, everybody thinks, oh my goodness, how do we stop this? How do we stop, you know, terrorists from having guns? But I'm kind of a big believer in reading the bills, you know, trying to figure out what's in them and whether it would work. As a physician, we try to look things very logically. What will work and what would have stopped this killing? So let's say you do what the Democrats want to do. They want to take away the Second Amendment rights of anybody on the terror list. Well, this killer wasn't on the list. And so I've been asking this question. I met with the FBI director. I've been asking this question over and over again. Why wasn't he on the list? And the answer I'm getting is that they investigated him a couple of times. They had an investigation over for 10 months, and then they closed it. And so my response to the FBI was, well, you said he wasn't a credible threat, and I understand you did your best, but he was a credible threat. Maybe we should leave the investigations open longer. And if there is an open investigation, you're on the list, and what happens currently is the FBI is called before you can buy a weapon. So we do have a system, but the system broke down here mainly because the FBI closed the investigation. And there's a lot of evidence why they might have should have kept it open. Several times, at least 2 or 3 times, he threatened coworkers. Even going back to 2007, he was kicked out of a police academy for threatening coworkers. Twice he said he was going to kill people and it was going to be part of an Islamic jihad. He went to Saudi Arabia. He also was in communication, if indirectly, some communication with a suicide bomber. You add all of that up and you're like, why in the world did they close the investigation? And then the news is today that I'm hearing, or in the last couple of days, he went to a gun store 5 weeks before this, tried to buy body armor and tried to buy 1,000 rounds of ammunition, and they actually called the FBI. And so I'm thinking, gosh, if I'm in the FBI, what would I do? I was like, maybe I would look in a 100-mile radius for people we've interviewed, take their pictures down to the gun store and say, which one of they didn't have his name, but I'm guessing they might have been able to catch this guy. So we've got to do a better job at trying to stop people, better police work. But it doesn't make sense. You know, a lot of people have been for gun control. National Democrats have been for more gun control and banning guns for a long time. But we have to decide would it worked. So they want to ban guns for people on the list. But the problem is the guy wasn't on the list, so it wouldn't fix the problem. What I'm doing is saying, I don't want terrorists to have guns. How would it actually fix the problem? So I am for legislation that would say we keep the FBI investigations open longer. And what we're going to put forward on Monday is that FBI investigations will be open for 5 years. If you start and you get interviewed, it's going to be open for 5 years. Doesn't mean they're looking at you the whole time, but it means you'd be on the list the whole time.
If you remain on that list, would you then be opposed to them being able to purchase a weapon?
Well, they wouldn't be able to. The FBI would be notified. Now, it doesn't mean that they're permanently prevented, though. What would have to happen is a court proceeding. And the reason we want that is that, let's say you and I work together and I'm Arab American and you don't like me and you decide to call the FBI and say that I made a threat to you at work. There's a lot of unfair threats that aren't real threats. The FBI has to work through these. The FBI has a very difficult job. So they work through these and then they remove people from the list. I wouldn't want to give up my First Amendment rights because you accused me of something or vice versa. Neither would I want to give up my Second Amendment rights, but I do want the FBI to get involved to say, should he purchase a weapon? The FBI immediately gets involved And they can either choose to arrest him, or they can choose to bring a court proceeding against him at that point in time. Or, and this is the reason why you may not want to just automatically take the gun purchase away, they may choose to follow him. It may be that they say, oh, we know he's associated with 4 other people. If we follow him to that house, then we can arrest them all. So it's a decision that has to be made in conjunction with the FBI. And I think that many have just sort of made this, you know, people who love gun control say, oh, this is an excuse now for gun control, but it really ought to be how do we stop terrorists?
But many in your party at this point seem to be open to this closing off, allowing anyone to purchase a gun on the watch list.
I think we're open to trying to figure out how we stop terrorists from having guns, and we just have different ideas on it. I guess for me, you know, the Bill of Rights are really important, and that they should be applied equally. So we've had times in our history when we didn't treat the Japanese fairly. We've had times when we didn't treat African Americans fairly. There could be a time when we don't treat Arab Americans fairly. So I think everybody deserves sort of the presumption of innocence. And so the list, the terror list, is a really, really big list, like maybe more than 1 million people. And the FBI will tell you that many people on there are not terrorists. So there needs to be a process. We need to be able to stop terrorists or potential terrorists from getting guns. It's just whether or not we're going to have what they call due process, where a person gets to defend themselves against an accusation. And a lot of us think the Constitution is important enough that we ought to make sure it's there for everyone.
Let's talk about some other issues. The Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton has promised a massive aid program for areas losing coal jobs. Republican Donald Trump has said he will bring coal jobs back, mining jobs back. Do you believe coal mining jobs would return in Kentucky if environmental regulations are loosened?
Yes. And I do think that we need to be clear what Hillary Clinton promised. She promised to put us out of business. She said we are going to continue to put coal miners and coal industry out of business. And then she said, oh, and then we'll get you some welfare after we put you out of business. The first thing we need to do is stop the regulations that are coming from President Obama, supported by Hillary Clinton, that are killing one of our industries. And I've traveled extensively throughout eastern Kentucky and western Kentucky, and there's a feeling of despair at all the jobs. There are some of our counties that have unemployment twice the national average. A lot of people out of work, and it's primarily because of President Obama and Hillary Clinton and their agenda, their war on coal. Will it all come back? I can't predict the future. Some of it is competition as well, but I can guarantee you that there are jobs that have been lost in Kentucky, thousands of jobs, because of President Obama's anti-coal war.
Your proposal, instead of, as you called it, a massive welfare program, but your proposal is something you've called economic freedom zones, and
right.
that changes the way taxes are done, right?
Yeah, Jack Kemp years ago talked about how can we help people who live in poverty. And this is, I think, a great idea, because what it does is it doesn't bring you a grant from Washington. It lowers the taxes so low that it leaves billions of dollars. So my plan would leave about $500 million in eastern Kentucky every year, which would be an enormous amount of money. $500 million left in eastern Kentucky. This would be a stimulus, but it wouldn't be a grant. What it would be is a lowering of taxes. I would lower the corporate tax to 5%, the personal income tax to 5%, and then for working class people that don't pay much income tax, I'd lower the payroll tax. But I'd do it for a long period of time. Eastern Kentucky is really struggling, and you know, $100,000 after-school basketball grant is not going to help Eastern Kentucky. We need something much more dramatic and much longer lasting, and I'm convinced it would help.
Would your goal in that case be to both ease a tax burden on existing businesses and attract others?
And it has to be both. That's another thing, because often states will say, oh, we'll give you an incentive. But it's hard to get new industry. So many people in eastern Kentucky will say, well, if we only had Toyota out here, because, you know, Toyota's been so great for Georgetown, but could we get Toyota to move out there? Well, maybe someday you get a big company to go, but in the meantime, while you're waiting for the big company to come, you need to lower the taxes to try to get your industry that is already in your community to grow more.
U.S. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky is our guest on WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. Our remaining minutes with him coming right up.